Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions series on writing a great research paper. This is the third program in the series. In the first two programs, we talked about how to develop an appropriate topic for your paper from the general subject assigned by your teacher, and about how to develop a working hypothesis to examine in your paper. We also discussed some of the basics of research, including the resources available at the library, the kinds of reference works you need to be familiar with, and how to create a preliminary bibliography, which is the first step in doing in-depth research. In this program, we're going to show you how to do a deeper dive into research sources, how to find materials both offline and on the internet that can help you become an expert on the topic of your paper. Traditional research techniques make use of offline resources, most of which can be found at either your local or school library. We spoke about some of these in the second program in this series. They include the librarian, a trained professional who can be amazingly helpful to you in focusing on useful and appropriate research materials, catalogs of various kinds which are like guides to the contents of the library, and various kinds of reference books from dictionaries and encyclopedias to gazetteers, chronologies, and books of quotations. Plan on spending at least a day or two working at the library and delving into the resources available there. Particularly in the early phases of any research project, you'll want to focus on how sources lead to sources. Start by studying the books or articles in your preliminary bibliography. The first book on the list will probably contain references to other books, as well as footnotes and a bibliography. Look closely at these, especially when they appear to relate to the specific topic you're writing about. When you spot the name of a book or article that looks helpful, write down all the bibliographic information. That means author, title and subtitle, the date and place of publication, the publisher, and the name of the magazine or journal, if relevant. These listings become part of your expanded bibliography. They're sources that you'll want to turn to next. And each of these books, articles, or other sources will contain further references that may be useful. After a day or two of following links in this way, you may find that the same books, articles, or authors are mentioned repeatedly. This is a strong clue that these sources are well known and are widely studied and are either considered authoritative, that is, worthy of your trust, or they're significant and controversial. Either way, you should find those landmark works and get to know them. That's part of becoming an expert in any particular field. You'll also find the same reference works, journals, and magazines mentioned repeatedly when you work within a particular field, and you'll need to get to know these as well. For example, suppose you're doing research in the world of music. The Music Index, which lists articles published in music journals, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, and the New Grove Dictionary of Opera are some of the basic sources that everyone needs to know to work in that field. If you're working in the field of literature, you'd want to be familiar with the MLA bibliography, which is compiled by the Modern Language Association. That lists writings dealing with literature in all modern languages, as well as reference works such as the Dictionary of Literary Biography and the Oxford Companion to English Literature. So whatever field you're working in, you'll want to become familiar with all the basic reference works, as well as the most important indexes and catalogs that are available in that field. That's part of becoming conversant with the material in a particular topic. If your topic stands at the intersection between two or more subject areas, you may need to delve into different fields and different sets of sources. Here's an example. Suppose you're interested in early recorded music, the first records that were made soon after Thomas Edison invented recording technology in 1877. You might decide that you're interested in studying how the careers of musicians were affected by this new technology. Did the new recording techniques make it possible for musicians to become stars and celebrities the way recording artists are today? Did it change the kinds of music they performed or the kinds of concerts that they did? This is a potentially very interesting topic for a paper. But to fully understand it, you might need to look at sources from three different fields: music, technology, and business, because all three might be relevant to this broader subject. So don't think narrowly inside a box. Whatever topic you're working on may have relevant roots in more than one field, and be sure to learn about all of those fields if necessary to do a thorough job of analyzing your topic. Perhaps the most powerful guide to traditional research sources is the bibliography. This is a reference work that lists books, articles, and other materials related to a particular subject. Bibliographies are available for practically any subject. For example, there's a 700-page bibliography of crime fiction that claims to list all mystery, detective, suspense, police, and Gothic fiction in book form published in the English language. If you're doing a research paper dealing with detective fiction, you'd certainly want to consult this book. There's a 5-volume bibliography called The Reader's Advisor that lists the best books in hundreds of specific fields and fields within fields. For example, The Reader's Advisor names, in the volume devoted to science, technology, and medicine, the best books in the field of ecology and environmental science. And within that, it lists the 10 most essential books on sociobiology, which deals with the genetics of animal behavior. So no matter what field you're working in, you might want to consult the Reader's Advisor to get a feeling for what titles experts in your particular field consider to be the most authoritative and important books on that topic. Within the field of American history, to pick another example, there are bibliographies of writings about the U.S. Senate, about American Civil War navies, about New York State in the American Revolution, and about American history as depicted in books for children. There are even bibliographies of bibliographies. So look for the relevant bibliography in whatever field you're working on. You'll find that someone has devoted years to putting together an authoritative list of the best books and research sources in that particular area, and therefore has done a lot of the background work for you. You can find bibliographies either in the reference section of your library or increasingly online. Now, a bibliography is very information dense. It's a reference work that is filled with facts, and to understand how it's organized is extremely important before you can use it effectively. Start by reading the bibliography's front matter, that is, the pages at the front of the book that explain how it's organized. Bibliographies vary. Some are arranged by author, some by topic or theme, some chronologically, and others in other ways. The organization may not be intuitively clear. The front matter also explains things like the use of abbreviations, which are often extensive, and it may contain a very detailed and helpful index. I know it's tempting to skip the front matter and start digging right into the listings of the bibliography, but please don't. You'll save yourself a lot of time if you know how the material is laid out and how to interpret it before you take the plunge. For example, Gale Research publishes several massive, multi-volume bibliographies dealing with literary criticism. They're divided into 3 sets by period. The first is called Literature Criticism, 1400 to 1800. The second, 19th century literature criticism. And the third, 20th century literary criticism. Yes, they are inconsistent in the use of the words literature and literary, but never mind that. Here's the important point. Suppose you were doing research into the literary works of the American novelist Samuel L. Clemens, who's usually known by his pen name, Mark Twain. In which set would you look? The obvious place to look is the second set, which deals with the 19th century, since the books that Twain is famous for, books like Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Life on the Mississippi, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, all of these were published in the 1870s and 1880s. But no, the editors at Gale chose to organize their sets according to the date of death of the author. Twain died in 1910, so he is classified as a 20th century author, even though most of his writings were published in the 19th century. Therefore, Twain's works are discussed in writings listed in the third set in the Gale series, not the second. The only way to know this is by reading the front matter, which explains how the bibliography is organized. If you were to skip that front matter, you'd probably plunge into the second set and become very frustrated because you couldn't find anything about Mark Twain, and you'd probably give up, not realizing that you were passing up a wonderful source of information just because you didn't know how it was organized. Some bibliographies describe and evaluate sources. This kind of bibliography is often called an annotated bibliography. This can be especially valuable. Every entry in an annotated bibliography is a kind of mini essay, a paragraph long, that describes the focus, the strengths, the weaknesses, and the key topics covered in a particular book or article. An annotated bibliography can help you quickly identify the books and articles that are most relevant to your research. So if there is an annotated bibliography available in your field, grab it. Finally, notice the age of the bibliography. You will probably need to supplement it with more recent sources, such as a current index of literature in a particular field, which will cover books and articles published after the bibliography was compiled. Bibliographies are a great tool for tracking books in a particular subject area, but they often neglect articles in newspapers, magazines, and scholarly journals. For those, you need to refer to a periodical index. Periodical indexes track, list, and organize the contents of specific periodicals or groups of periodicals. You'll want to use these indexes when you're researching a general topic for which you don't have a list of specific articles, but which you know or suspect has been written about widely in magazines, newspapers, or scholarly journals. Sometimes going back to articles written at the time of an event can be very important and revealing, depending on the kind of research you're doing. Suppose you were researching a specific incident in the history of the Vietnam War, namely the Tonkin Gulf incident, which took place in 1965. This was a minor military skirmish between Vietnamese and U.S. warships, which ultimately led to the deeper involvement of the U.S. in the war, so it turned out to be quite an important event in the unfolding history of Vietnam. Now, you could read about the Tonkin Gulf incident in secondary sources, books written by historians after the war, for example. But you probably also want to read some primary sources, which are materials written at the time, reflecting how people thought and felt about the event at the time it was happening. A periodical index that covers the year 1965 would help you track down articles showing how the Tonkin Gulf incident was written about in newspapers, in news magazines, and journals of opinion at the time it happened. And this would enable you more accurately to describe what opinion makers and the general public knew about Tonkin Gulf and what they thought about it at the time it happened, as opposed to just reading historians' opinions about it from years later. Now, periodical indexes were formerly kept in bound book form in the reference section of the library, and you'll still find some periodical indexes this way. Now, however, periodical indexes are mostly online. However, you need to be aware that online indexes are often limited just to the last few years. You might find, for example, a particular index that only goes back the last 7, 8, or 10 years, while older materials are still covered in printed and bound periodical indexes. So if you find scanty materials about your topic in an online index, don't give up. You may need to find a printed index to locate older materials that are still relevant. And as usual, your reference librarian is the best asset to locating the indexes that are most helpful for a particular topic. One periodical index that you may already be familiar with is the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature. This is often used by high school students in particular because it covers general magazines, all of which are listed in the front of the index. So pull out any volume of the Reader's Guide, look in the front, and you'll see the complete list of all the magazines that are covered. And the most popular general magazines, from Life and Time magazine right on down, will be included in the Reader's Guide. It's issued in annual volumes with current paperback supplements that are issued monthly. So you can look up any particular year and see how a topic that was in the news was being covered in magazines at that time. Within the index, the contents are organized by author and subject, so you can look up the name of a writer of an article or a particular topic, such as Tonkin Gulf. It lists the author, the magazine, the date, the page number, and illustrations, if any. And all of this information can be useful to you in going through the index and figuring out which articles are most likely to be relevant to the kind of paper you're writing. The Reader's Guide covers general interest magazines, but there are specialized periodical indexes in almost every field, and as you advance in your academic career through college and perhaps into graduate school, you'll want to get to know the periodical indexes that deal with your particular subject area. Art Abstracts, for example, deals with journals from the field of art. The International Index to Music periodicals deals with that field. And we've already mentioned the MLA bibliography, which you need to know if you're going to be a student of English literature, Russian literature, French literature, or almost any other topic in modern literature. When you find an article listed in a periodical index, whether it's in print form or online, note all the bibliographic data for any article that you may want to use. That would include the name of the author, the title of the article, the periodical in which it appeared, the date, the page number, and, if relevant, the volume and issue number. Not every periodical uses these, but most do. Having all this information written down at the beginning of your search will make it easy to track down the specific article so you can read it, evaluate it, and decide how relevant it is to your research project. Now, there are also broader online information services, which are often referred to as journal databases, which you might think of as indexes of indexes. These are online databases of periodical articles that cover a wide range of periodicals. These are searchable using Boolean search engines, which we'll be explaining shortly. So you can actually search through the contents of the articles using various kinds of search terms, which can help you zero in on specific articles that deal with the topic you're researching. LexisNexis and EBSCOhost are two examples of online information services or journal databases. Again, they're available at your library, and your librarian can guide you to the ones that are likely to be most relevant to your research project. Finally, there are also newspaper indexes, which cover particular newspapers, ranging from the New York Times, which is often considered the paper of record, the authoritative source for information about current events, to papers like the Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, and, of course, local newspapers from around the country and the world. If you were studying events of national or world importance, you might want to refer first to the New York Times. But suppose you were researching something that happened in your community, then finding an index for your hometown newspaper might be the most useful, because that's where the topic would probably have been covered in the greatest depth. Newspapers, as we've mentioned, are very useful for contemporary views of people or events. The Times Index, to use that as an example, is found in bound form in many libraries, bound by year, and it lists the complete contents of the newspaper, articles about every conceivable topic. Each article has a brief summary with the date, the page number, and the column of the page on which the article can be found. Once again, those summaries can help you quickly decide which out of, let's say, 20 articles on a given topic might be most relevant to you. You might only need to actually look up 3 of the articles that go into the topic in the most depth and in a way that is specifically related to your paper. Now, the archive of the Times from the first issue back in 1851 is also available online through a service hosted by a company called ProQuest, and there may be a small charge on getting complete articles printed out from this online service. But it's very useful if you're studying historical events and want to get a sense of how those events were viewed at the time they happened. You can search this archive using keywords contained in articles. For example, let's say you wanted to find a contemporary account of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, which took place in April 1865. You could search through the New York Times for articles containing the keywords Lincoln and assassination, and limit the search to the period from, let's say, April 1st, 1865 through May 1st, 1865. This way you would only get articles dealing with the assassination that were published at the very time the event took place. And when you actually do this search, you'll find that 38 articles were printed during that month in the New York Times dealing with Lincoln's murder. And of course, it was a world-shaking event, so it was covered quite extensively in the paper. And the very first article is summarized in the online database this way. President Lincoln shot by an assassin, the deed done at Ford's Theater last night, the act of a desperate rebel. The president still alive at last accounts, no hopes entertained of his recovery, attempted assassination of Secretary Seward, details of the dreadful tragedy. Isn't this a remarkable glimpse of what history looked like at the time it was happening? If you were writing something about contemporary views of Lincoln and his murder, this would be a wonderful source to turn to first. Once you find an article you want, it may be available either online or on microfilm in your library, and particular pages can usually be printed out for you so you can refer to them and quote them at length. Once again, your librarian will be able to help you zero in on the particular indexes that are most likely to be useful for your paper. So far, we've been talking about traditional methods of research, most of which would have been available to your parents or grandparents when they were students in high school or college. In recent years, these traditional methods of research have been expanded tremendously by new online techniques that use the power of the internet. Most students are aware that their computers have the ability to reach into millions of sources of information, but many of them don't really know how to use the new online tools. So in the rest of this program, we're going to focus on this new arena and give you some tips on making the most of online research sources. The internet is an ever-changing world of billions of web pages, each created by an individual, a group, an organization, a company, a government agency, a university, an advocacy group, or some other institution, all of which want to post online information, ideas, or opinions that they have so that the whole world can see them and get access to them. This is why the internet is a continually growing and diversifying world, because of all these thousands of organizations and individuals who want to get the word out about their particular area of interest or expertise. All of these become resources that are available to you from your home or from the computer in your library. Now, the internet is gradually evolving over time into a kind of universal library where much of the contents of the world's traditional libraries can be found. Projects are actually underway as I speak, whereby millions of traditional books are being scanned by computers and made available online. Now, it'll be years before these projects are completed, so there's still no substitute for going to a traditional library and requesting actual printed books. Many of these are not going to be available from your computer for quite some time. Right now, we're in a kind of time of transition when some books, some periodicals, and some other information sources are available online while others are not. Online research has both advantages and disadvantages. Here are some of the advantages. Unlike a traditional library, the contents of the internet are mostly searchable. This means that individual words, phrases, topics, and even images or pictures can be located by search engines at incredible speeds. This means that rather than having to wander through a library, pulling down volumes from the shelves and trying to find topics that you're interested in, you can search using the internet to find just where those topics are mentioned in particular web pages. By contrast, the content of traditional offline libraries can only be glimpsed from the outside using resources like catalogs and bibliographies, which mostly simply summarize the contents and merely scratch the surface. On the other hand, online research does have its disadvantages. The sheer vastness of the internet is one of those disadvantages. Because it's so vast, it can be confusing, and the relative lack of order, the chaos that rules the internet, can make it very hard to find a specific piece of information. No one is in charge of the internet. Anyone who wants to can post contents online, and therefore it's kind of a free-for-all, with millions or billions of web pages jostling for your attention. To make things more complicated, different methods of searching the internet are going to yield different kinds of results. And the internet doesn't have any hierarchy or any built-in evaluative mechanisms. In other words, there's no one to tell you, well, this source is one that can be relied upon, while this one is not really reliable or truthful. You've got to figure out for yourself what to read and what to pay attention to, and which items on the internet ought to be ignored. Materials that are valuable, reliable, and important are there on the internet right alongside materials that are biased, inaccurate, and worthless, and only you can figure out which is which. For all these reasons, most teachers will not accept a research paper that is based entirely on internet sources, which is why we did not begin this program by saying, sit down at your computer and let it fly. You really need to start your online research after you've done some offline research so that you have a pretty good idea of what you're looking for. Then you can develop a search strategy that will help you focus on what you need. In fact, the best way to begin an online search for any particular topic is to have an idea of the kind of ideal resource that you'd like to find to deal with a particular topic. In a sense, you'll be working backwards. Think about the perfect book or article that will answer the kinds of questions you're trying to deal with in your paper, and then develop search strategies that will help you focus in on that ideal book or article. If you were researching, for example, a particular historical figure and you wanted to know something about how that person rose to power and came to influence world events, what would be the kind of ideal resource that might contain information that you need about this person's career? Well, a biography would be one obvious choice. If a life story of this person has been written, that would be the kind of resource that you'd want to find. A history dealing with that particular period of history would be a useful resource. That's another kind of book or article that you'd want to find. And if this person held power and dealt with particular topics, let's say war and peace, or economics, or improving the education system, books dealing with each of those topics might be relevant resources. So one way to begin your online research process is by thinking backwards. Try to imagine the kind of perfect book or article that would help you most in writing your own research paper, and then develop search strategies that will help you zero in on the internet to find that particular kind of resource. Chances are good you'll find exactly what you need by using that type of strategy. Now, the basic tool for researching any topic on the internet is something called a search engine. This is a software program that's capable of looking through a collection of online sources at incredible speed, looking for web pages that include particular words, phrases, or topics, or meet other criteria that you set. Think of a search engine as a computerized robot that can flip through billions of websites within seconds, looking for something that you're interested in. Today, there are many search engines available for free on the internet. They're free mainly because the companies that created them use them to attract visitors to their websites, where they can show them advertising for which they get paid. So you benefit from the availability of these free search engines. Right now, 4 of the most popular search engines are Google, Yahoo, Windows Live Search, and Ask.com. But new search engines are being created all the time, some of them with specialized functions in mind. Many of these are popular, and they're less well known than the big 4, but they can still prove quite useful. Your study guide contains a list of some of the best search engines that are around, some popular, some lesser known, with brief descriptions of what each search engine can and cannot do, and we suggest you give them a try. Most people are familiar nowadays with the concept of a search engine, and for example, the idea of Googling someone or something to learn a bit about them is familiar to many people. But most people don't really know how search engines work, and they don't understand what powerful research tools search engines can really be. So in the next few minutes in this program, we're going to delve in quite a bit of depth into how search engines work and give you ideas of some specific tips you can use to make your research online much more effective than you might have ever thought possible. Most search engines work in a similar fashion. The search engine allows you to type in one or more terms, words or phrases, into a search box. It then returns lists of web pages that include the terms you listed, and these may be called hits, matches, or results. Some search engines also list paid advertisements related to your search terms. When you're doing research for a paper, these ads will probably be irrelevant to your work. For example, if you were researching Lincoln's assassination, a search engine might list ads for companies that sell Lincoln memorabilia or DVDs about Lincoln's assassination. On the other hand, if you were using a search engine for some other kinds of searches, the ads might actually be helpful. If you were using a search engine to find a used car, then an ad from a used car dealer might be relevant. Not really for schoolwork, however. When you're entering search terms into the search box, you almost always want to use more than one term. Otherwise, your results will be much too scattershot. For example, a Google search using just the one term Malcolm X yields 4 million hits, that is, web pages that are supposedly relevant to the topic of Malcolm X. And they would be listed in order of relevance, so that the ones that appear first in the listing of hits are supposed to be the ones that are likely to be most useful to most people. But when we look at the first page, we see that it includes an incredible grab bag of stuff ranging from the official website run by Malcolm X's estate, including a brief biography, a photo gallery, and information for contacting the people in charge of the estate, to a Malcolm X research site run by a book publisher and a professor at the University of Toledo, a Wikipedia entry about Malcolm X, in other words, a description of the life of Malcolm X from an online encyclopedia, a web page about the Spike Lee movie that deals with the life of Malcolm X, the homepage of the Malcolm X College in Chicago, a brief biography of Malcolm X excerpted from the African American Almanac on the website of the book's publisher, and finally the website of the Malcolm X Project at Columbia University, which describes the research and educational programs that they're working on there. Now, depending on the particular type of paper you want to write about Malcolm X, some of these websites might be relevant, but the chances are good that many of them are not. So doing a web search based on just a single term is going to give you an unbelievable assortment of things which will deal with the topic from many different angles, only one or two of which are likely to be relevant to you. And that's why using more than one search term is almost essential if you're going to get usable results. However, if you narrow the search by adding a second term, the number of hits goes way down, and the relevance of the materials that turn up on the first page of results goes way up. For example, suppose we wanted to compare Malcolm X with Martin Luther King. If we use both of those terms in our search, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, we get about 1 million hits. Still a very large number, but only about 1/4 of the 4 million hits we got when we searched for Malcolm X alone. If we are interested in how Malcolm X met his death when he was murdered by a group of dissidents within his own organization, we could type in Malcolm X and assassination, and we'd get 500,000 hits. If we were interested in the development of Malcolm X's philosophy toward integration, we could type in the terms Malcolm X, integration, philosophy, and we'd get 300,000 hits. And if we were particularly focused on how Malcolm X's philosophy about integration evolved during the year 1965, toward the end of his life, we could type in Malcolm X, integration, philosophy, 1965, and we'd get 131,000 hits. And these would be mostly web pages focusing on how Malcolm X's philosophy evolved during that year. The numbers keep going down the more terms we add and the more specific the search becomes. The numbers become more manageable and the results become more relevant. This is the benefit of a more focused search. Now, the group of terms that you enter into the search engine is called a query string. As you can see, choosing the terms to include in your query string is a key to doing online research. To know how to choose the terms, you need to understand how search engines work, what's going on under the hood of these amazing software machines. Most search engines use some form of what's called Boolean logic. It's named after George Boole, who was a self-educated English mathematician of the 19th century. He laid out an algebraic system of logic in a book grandiosely titled The Laws of Thought. Boolean logic uses three tools or logical operators, and, or, and not, to categorize web pages and therefore help focus your search results. These operators serve to limit the enormous number of results that most web searches yield. Now, if you link your search terms using the operator and, you'll get search results that contain both terms. For example, if you search for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, you'll get web pages that mention both men. The operator or yields results that contain either term. So if you search for Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, you'll get web pages that mention either man or both men. Not yields results that contain one term but not the other. So if you were to search for Malcolm X, not Martin Luther King, you will get web pages that mention Malcolm X but not ones that mention King. Any web page that mentioned Martin Luther King would be excluded from that kind of search. As a general rule, the more terms in your query that are linked with and, the fewer results you will get because you're specifying more and more terms that must be included in a web page before it passes muster. So the longer the number of terms you create linked by and, the narrower the number of results you'll get. The more terms in your query that are linked with or, then the more results you will get. Because if you have many words linked with or, you are saying to the search engine, give me any web page that mentions any of these, and that's casting a very wide net. Be most cautious using not links, because these may eliminate results that you actually want. So if you find when you do your first search that you're not getting very good results or you're getting too few, try eliminating any not links that you've used, and you may find that you get more materials like the ones you're looking for. Now, in addition to these three operators, and, or, and not, there are two punctuation marks that can be used in conjunction with Boolean operators to further focus your search results. First, quotation marks. When you place quotation marks around a complete name or a phrase in your query, that yields results that contain that exact name or phrase. For example, you may want to use this to get two words only when they are side by side rather than separated by a few words. For example, suppose you wanted to find websites that dealt with the topic of human evolution. If you did a search just for human evolution, the search engine would treat them as two separate terms and would give you any website that contained the word human and the word evolution, even if those were a number of paragraphs apart. If you put the phrase human evolution into quotation marks, it'll cut down the number of hits by a factor of 20 perhaps, because it will eliminate any site that simply mentions the word human and the word evolution separately and focuses only on websites that specifically discuss human evolution. You may also want to use quotation marks to get an exact quotation. So suppose, for example, you wanted to track down the source of a famous phrase that's associated with Malcolm X, his phrase, by any means necessary. If you wanted to find that, you would want to type in the phrase, by any means necessary, into your search engine and enclose the entire thing in quotation marks. And then the search engine would yield results which would include only web pages that contain that entire phrase. Now notice that Google and many other search engines automatically eliminate common words from your search string. So words like the, which, for, to, would not be considered part of the query if you type them into the search engine. So if you really need a particular common word to be part of your search, use quotation marks to include it in the specific phrase you're looking for. Here's an example. Suppose you were researching the story behind the Beatles song, A Day in the Life. If you type in those words into Google, for example, you'll get hits that include millions of websites that include the two words day and life, which Google considers to be significant. They consider the words a, in, and the to be common words, and they therefore don't even take them into account in conducting the search. For example, if you do that search on Google, you might get a link to Life magazine, including its photo feature, Picture of the Day. The fact that the website contains the word life and the word day makes Google think that it's relevant to the search, a day in the life. Instead, type in the entire phrase, a day in the life, and include it within quotation marks. Now the search engine knows you're only looking for that entire phrase, all those words together, including the common words. If you add in the word Beatles for good measure, you'll only get web pages that deal with that Beatles song. By the way, when you're interested in searching for a proper name, particularly a person's name, quotation marks around the entire name are tremendously useful. For example, suppose you were doing a search for Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights leader. If you don't put quotation marks around the entire name, the web pages that you get in response to that search will include pages dealing with Martin Luther, the German theologian who was one of the founders of the Protestant Reformation, not really relevant to the search that you're trying to conduct. So put Martin Luther King Jr. in quotation marks, and you'll only get websites dealing with that particular person. Parentheses are another useful punctuation tool. As in mathematics, placing parentheses around operations in your query allows you to specify the order of operations. Any operations that are contained within parentheses will be done first. before operations that are outside the parentheses. Here are some examples of how you can use these tools of Boolean logic to refine your online search. Let's say you want to research quotations by Malcolm X that illustrate how his philosophies about race, civil rights, and integration evolved over time. While searching, however, you want to save time by eliminating, for example, results that refer to the 1992 Spike Lee movie, also called Malcolm X. If you do a quick, rough search using a search engine and just enter Malcolm X, you'll find many, many websites that deal with Spike Lee's movie, and those are just going to distract you from your real focus. So how could we combine the techniques that we've learned so far to submit an appropriate query to a Boolean search engine? First, let's list all the terms that a desirable search result must include, and we'll use quotation marks around any exact phrase or name. We'll call these the yeses, and I think we have two yeses that ought to apply to this particular search: Malcolm X and quotes. So Malcolm X with quotation marks around it to indicate that we're looking for that exact phrase or name, and the word quotes, because we're looking for quotes or quotations by Malcolm X. These are our yeses. So in our search engine's query box, we will link the yeses together with and operators, because remember, an and operator indicates that both of the terms that are being connected need to be included in the search results, and we'll place parentheses around the entire set of yeses. Next, let's list all the terms that a desirable search result must not include. In this case, this could be Spike Lee and the word movie to eliminate results that refer to the 1992 movie about Malcolm X. And we'll call these the no's. Let's list these no's using quotation marks around any exact phrases or names. So we'll put quotation marks around Spike Lee, and movie is our other no. We go back to the query box and we'll type a not operator. And now we'll link all the no's together with or operators, because either of these would be sufficient to eliminate a website from our search. And we'll place parentheses around the entire set of no's, Spike Lee or movie. The parentheses tell the search engine that all of the terms within the parenthesis are no's, because they both are subject to the workings of the not operator. And our query string now looks like this: open parentheses, quote Malcolm X, close quotes, and quotes, close parentheses, not, open parentheses, quotation marks, Spike Lee, close quotation marks, or movie, close parentheses. Finally, let's brainstorm about all the things that a desirable search result might possibly include. Remember, we're looking for websites that will talk about how Malcolm X's philosophy on race, on civil rights, and integration evolved over time. So in this case, we'd be looking for words that Malcolm X might have used, or general topics that might appear on a page that would also include quotations by Malcolm X. So let's list these. We'll call them maybes, and use quotation marks around any exact phrase or name. And in this case, we can come up with three maybes: race, civil rights, that's an exact phrase that we want duplicated, so we'll put quotation marks around it, and integration. Those are our three maybes. Go back to the query box one more time. We'll type an and operator after the closing parentheses that conclude the no's, and now link all the maybes together with or operators, because we don't necessarily have to have all three of these maybes in a website. We would just like to have any one of them, and place parentheses around the set of maybes. And our query string now looks like this: parentheses, quote Malcolm X, close quotes, and quotes, close parentheses, not, parentheses, quote Spike Lee, close quotes, or movie, close parentheses, and here come our maybes, parentheses, race, or, quote civil rights, close quotes, or integration, close parentheses. As in mathematics, the parentheses indicate operations that should be performed together. So you notice the parentheses around Spike Lee or movie, all of that following the operator not. That tells you that it's not Spike Lee, and it's also not movie, because both of those are included within the parentheses. This may be a little confusing at first, but with some practice you'll get a sense as to how to use these operators and the punctuation marks in order to make your search very focused. So rather than coming up with hundreds of thousands of hits or results for a particular search, you're much more likely to come up with a few hundred or even a few dozen hits, each of which will be precisely targeted to the kind of information that you want. Now, in this example, it's easy to see that the maybes are the most variable. There's all kinds of maybes that could be thrown into a particular search, and you'll find through experimentation which ones work better and which ones work less well. In this particular case, if the results that I got for the search were not particularly useful, if I didn't come up with websites that contained the kind of information I was looking for, then I would probably change some of the maybes, and I would use some other terms such as racism, for example, segregation, white, black, and so on. And by experimentation, it might take 5, 6, or 8 tries at a search, but eventually I would come up with a wonderful array of websites that contained exactly the kind of information I was looking for. Another reminder, the knots are the most troublesome and tricky, and you might find, if you're not getting the results you want, that you want to eliminate the knots. In this case, for example, we have the term movie as a knot because we were trying to avoid the Spike Lee movie and websites related to that. On the other hand, the word movie could conceivably be relevant to Malcolm X in some other context. For example, there might have been some movies that Malcolm X boycotted or protested against because of their racial content. And if those were discussed in a historical website dealing with the life of Malcolm X, those websites might have been eliminated from our search, even though that wasn't the kind of movie we were trying to eliminate. So occasionally a knot can inadvertently eliminate things you really want. If you find that that's happening, experiment with eliminating the knot and see how the results change. You see that the philosophy of doing a search on the internet has to be one of experimentation. If your first or second or third attempt doesn't yield the results that you expect or that you're looking for, try another variation, and in time you'll develop techniques that work really well for you and in particular yield the results you need for the paper you're working on. Here's another simple example. Let's say you're taking a psychology course and you want to write a paper about the causes of clinical depression, the mental disorder that some people suffer from. If you type causes of depression into a search engine, you'll get many, many hits, and you'll quickly find that many of them deal with economic depressions. In other words, times when the economy stops growing and many people are thrown out of work and so forth, as well as psychological depression. How could you avoid this problem? Here's one way of doing it. Use a query string like the following to eliminate all the websites that focus on economic depressions. You could use this query string. Parentheses, depression and causes, close parentheses, not, parentheses, great or economic, close parentheses, and parentheses, psychiatry or, quote, mental illness, close quotes, close parentheses. You see that the key here is the not, great or economic. The word economic would eliminate the economic depression, and great would eliminate the phrase the Great Depression, which is usually used by historians to describe the enormous economic dislocation that occurred in the 1930s. Once again, those not operators can be a bit tricky, and if you find that you're not getting very many or very good results, you might want to experiment with eliminating or changing some of the not results, because the word great and the word economic can, of course, be used in other contexts. But this would be a good way to start dealing with the problem of economic depression versus psychological depression. So this is how Boolean logic basically works on the internet. The key is the use of those three operators, and, or, and not. It would be nice if every search engine used these tools in the same way. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Instead, there are almost as many variations as there are search engines. Here are some of the variations to be aware of. Today, most search engines, including Google, use symbols as opposed to the spelled-out operators and, or, and not. The symbol plus is the equivalent of and. The symbol pipe, it's a vertical line which is called a pipe, is the equivalent of or. And the symbol dash, a minus sign, in effect, is the equivalent of not. Most search engines default to and when you submit a query without any Boolean operator between your terms. So if, for example, you simply list Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, just like that, in a query box, then the search engine will probably treat each of those terms as and terms and will look for websites that include each and all of those terms. They treat them as if they were joined by the and operator. Now, Google treats all terms as and links, but it gives higher ranking to pages based on various characteristics, most of which are known and publicly understood. But with experimentation, you'll begin to get a feeling for the kinds of pages that tend to migrate to the top of the search engine's list. In other words, the first page or two of results that you get when you do a search. For example, Google gives a higher ranking to pages that contain all the terms as opposed to just one or two or some of the terms. If you scroll through a Google results listing down to the 100th or 500th or 1000th result, or the 1000th hit, you'll probably begin to find web pages that only contain one or some of the search terms that you've entered in your query string, as opposed to all of them. Google also gives a higher ranking to web pages that contain the terms in close proximity. In other words, if the words are right next to one another or only a few words or a few lines apart, that web page would tend to get a higher ranking as opposed to a web page that contained the terms, but they were paragraphs or pages apart. Third, Google gives a higher ranking to pages that are popular among other users. In other words, web pages that contain more links to other web pages and therefore appear to be frequently referred to by many internet users tend to get higher ranking in the Google search engine. And this is true of many other search engines as well. So there's a kind of continual popularity contest going on the internet. Pages that tend to gravitate toward the top of search engines would be pages that more people have used and linked to in recent days or months. This may mean that those pages would tend to be more mainstream in their opinions and perhaps more reliable or authoritative in terms of the facts that they present, but that's not always the case. One of the reasons that a search for Malcolm X, for example, tends to yield a lot of pages dealing with Spike Lee's movie is just because there are so many movie fans and lots of people are interested in clicking on web pages that deal with movies. If you're trying to write a scholarly paper about the life of Malcolm X, this is not relevant to you and not terribly helpful. So the popularity ranking may or may not be helpful or useful to you as a search engine user. It's important to be aware of it because that's part of what underlies the logic of the web pages that are going to be selected to be presented to you at the top of your results page. Google also lets you use plus to include common words. So, for example, if there was a particular common word in, which, from, or, to, and, those kinds of words that was important to include in a particular search, you could use quotation marks around the entire phrase to explicitly include all of those words, or you can simply put a plus sign in front of each of those words, and that way Google knows, don't ignore this term, instead use it as part of our search. Google also uses the dash or the minus sign as the equivalent of not, and it uses or to capture pages that have one term or another term, but not necessarily all of the terms that you've listed. However, Google does ignore parentheses, so therefore the use of that punctuation mark as a search engine tool is not possible if you happen to be searching with Google. So how do you perform a complex Boolean search if you're using a search engine like Google that ignores parentheses and uses symbols like plus signs and minus signs? Don't worry, it's pretty simple. You continue to think in terms of yeses, nos, and maybes. Let's take as an example a Boolean search we've already discussed. Moments ago, we covered how to search for Malcolm X quotes that might include the terms race, civil rights, and integration, while excluding results that refer to the Spike Lee movie called Malcolm X. To perform that same complex search in Google, we could just enter the following into our query box. Quote, Malcolm X, end quote, quotes, minus, quote, Spike Lee, end quote, minus movie, race, or, quote, civil rights, end quote, or integration. Let's break that down so you understand what we've done here. To create this query string, we included first the yeses, then the nos with a minus sign preceding each no, and finally the maybes separated by or operators. Now, alternatively, we could perform separate searches that include one maybe at a time. For example, we could start by searching for, quote, Malcolm X, end quote, quotes, minus, quote, Spike Lee, end quote, minus movie, race. And then perform additional searches for the same string, but replacing race with, quote, civil rights, end quote, and then the same string, but replacing, quote, civil rights, end quote, with integration. I'm sure that with a little experimentation and the techniques we've described, you'll soon be able to make the most of Google and other search engines that use symbols and so on to simplify Boolean web searches. In addition, to make things even easier for their users, some search engines like AltaVista and Google, for example, provide what they call advanced versions of their web searching tools. These allow you to apply Boolean logic using a form rather than with operator symbols. You can get to Google Advanced just by clicking on the words Advanced Search where they appear on the Google homepage. When you have a form, your search is driven by what you type into which field of the form. So they'll give you a box in which to type all your yeses, another box in which to type all your no's, another box in which to type your maybes, and perhaps another box in which to type any exact phrases that you're seeking. The Boolean logic works just the same. The only difference is how you convey it to the computer and to the search engine software. Finally, here are a few other search tips that most students don't know about, but which can be tremendously useful. Google and some other search engines automatically search for words that share the same stem as one of your search terms. This is known as stemming. For example, suppose you were researching Picasso's painting Guernica, and you launched a search that included both Guernica and Picasso and the search term painting. Google and many other web search engines would automatically search not only for the word painting, but also for words like paint, painted, paints, and painter. This is a very useful tool. It certainly broadens the number of web pages that the search engine will select, and it means you don't have to go to the trouble of typing in all those different variations in order to be sure that the concept that you're looking for is included. On Google, and again on some other search engines, you can have synonyms included in a search by inserting the curly symbol known as the tilde before a search term. As you know, synonyms are words that mean the same or almost the same as other words. And quite often, a particular web page may discuss a topic that you're interested in, but may use language that's slightly different than the words you happen to enter into the search engine. And therefore, this synonym search capability is quite helpful. Suppose, for example, you were researching early music recordings. If you launched a search that used a tilde in front of the search term music, you would get web pages that include the word music, but also web pages that include words like sound and audio. If you launch a search using the word military, but put a tilde in front of the word military to include synonyms, you would get web pages that refer to the Army, the Navy, and warfare, all of which Google's search engine regards as being, in some sense, synonymous with the military, and that may or may not be helpful. Again, with experimentation, you might want to eliminate the tilde if you're getting too many results that are too diffuse and not truly relevant to the kind of results you're looking for. So experiment with the tilde. Sometimes it can be tremendously helpful. Other times it can produce results that are more distracting. Some search engines, again including Google, allow you to include something called wildcards in your query. Wildcards are special characters, usually asterisks, but sometimes question marks, that take the place of unknown characters in words or unknown words within phrases. Wildcards are especially helpful when spellings are only partially known or vary. So, for example, let's say you were doing research on the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. That name Gaddafi can be spelled beginning with a G or with a Q. You could use a wildcard in place of that first character, and you would end up getting websites no matter which way they spell Gaddafi's name, which is what you want. You don't want to eliminate websites just because the name happens to be spelled differently. That would be an example of how you could use a wildcard. Wildcard is also useful when multiple words that you might otherwise link in your query with an OR operator contain some of the same letters, or when you have phrases that contain some of the same words but some words that vary. For example, you might want to create a query string like this: American asterisk war. The asterisk is a wildcard that could substitute for any other word. If you were to try a search using this query string, you would end up with websites that deal with the American Civil War, the American Revolutionary War, and various other American wars which are described in a phrase like that, American blank war. So using the wildcard can occasionally be very helpful when you want to broaden your search just enough to include a variety of variations on a particular word or phrase. Here's another great technique. You can use numbers to limit a search. Let's say, for example, that you wanted to find only information sources published in or dealing with the year 2005. You can create your query string, writing in the words about whatever topic you're interested in, and then just add 2005 as another term. And now only websites that talk about the year 2005 would be included in the results. You could also use a number range by separating the numbers with 2 periods and no spaces on either side. So for example, you could create a query string like this: Picasso criticism, 1937, period, 1940. Now, the results that you get from this particular query would include criticism about or by Picasso dealing with the years 1937, 1938, 1939, and 1940. Let's say, for example, that you were researching the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. If you try a search that simply states French Revolution or Russian Revolution, you're likely to end up with websites that are actually irrelevant to what you're interested in because there was more than one upheaval known as the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution. If you were specifically focused on the 1905 Russian Revolution, then using 1905 as one term in the query string would ensure that you would only get results relevant to what you were actually interested in. Let's say you were researching trucks of a certain weight. You could actually put in the numbers representing the weight, the number of pounds that you're looking for, separate them by 2 dots, and you would only get trucks that are in that particular weight class. So numbers can be a great way to limit a search. You can even focus your search on a particular website. Once you've found, for example, a particular website that is filled with great information about your topic, perhaps it's run by an organization devoted to research in your topic, you can create a query string just like any other query string and then add the site name to the query string, and the search will be conducted only within that website. The way you would do it is you would type site, S-I-T-E, colon, and then the name of the website, xyz.com, for example. And that would only yield results, web pages, that are in that particular website. You are, in effect, telling the search engine, just do a detailed search within this website and give me everything they've ever published that's relevant to my topic. In the same way, you can focus only on websites within a particular web domain. As you may know, the domains are vast areas within the internet that are generally focused on particular types of characteristics. The most commonly known domain is the .com domain. Most websites that are used most often end in .com, and that's the biggest of the web domains. But there are many other domains, and most of them have specific characteristics. So, for example, if you wanted to search only academically oriented sites, mostly run by universities, you would add the following to your query string: site, edu. This would restrict the search to the edu domain, which is only websites run by educational institutions. For another search, you might want to only search government websites, websites run by branches of the federal government. In that case, you would add to your query string site, S-I-T-E, gov, G-O-V, and that would restrict the search to the gov domain. Finally, you might want to try using the Google Images search option. This can be very helpful for locating photos, paintings, graphs, maps, tables, and charts. Type in a query string very similar to the kind of query string you do for a Google text search, and you'll end up with all kinds of pictures from websites that mention those particular terms. Some may be very relevant to your work. As you can see, conducting an online search can be very complicated, and search engines vary quite a bit. They have different capabilities, new tricks and tools are constantly being developed, and each one applies Boolean logic in a slightly different way using different symbols and different techniques. One lesson is always read the help page of the search engine that you're using, or the frequently asked questions page. This will go into quite a bit of detail about the exact use of Boolean operators and other tools that are available using that search engine. And you will quickly discover a number of very powerful techniques that you weren't aware of. And you may find that there are ways of doing things that you never imagined on your particular favorite search engine. So do read the FAQ section or the help page to learn how your favorite search engine works. And then experiment with it until you're getting the kinds of responses that you need and are looking for. And the first time you launch a search for a particular topic, don't just accept the first page or two of results. The chances are good that your search needs to be further tweaked in order to be truly useful. So expect to conduct the same search several times in order to find the pages that are most relevant to whatever topic you're really researching. Chances are good that you'll need to add some more ands, some more maybes, and perhaps some nots in order to focus more specifically on the kinds of websites that contain information that is truly relevant to what you're searching for. And remember, every time you find a website that you think may be relevant, you don't have to necessarily stop your search in order to begin reading all the pages on the site and jotting down information from that site for your paper. Instead, simply mark it as one of the favorites on your web browser. And that way, the web browser will always keep the name and address of that website handy, and you can refer to it easily with just a click of the mouse anytime you want to. So for any particular research project that you're working on, create a file of favorite web pages relevant to that particular research project. By the time you conclude a number of searches, you may have 8, 10, or even 20 favorite websites that are particularly useful for researching that topic. And having that file of favorites on your computer will make it easy to go back to them again and again and continue to delve more information out of those valuable pages. In your study guide that accompanies this program, we provided some further information about various search engines and search techniques. There's so much that we don't have time to cover in this program. We urge you to go to your study guide and learn more about how to use your computer as a powerful online research tool. The world of the internet is continually changing, and we urge you to approach it in a spirit of experimentation and discover all the wealth of things that are available there to supplement the offline techniques that we've also been teaching you about. Well, you now have a huge trove of potentially useful materials, but sorting through it all is not so easy. How do you know which of these web pages or offline research materials are most useful? How do you know which ones you can rely upon? And how do you turn this mass of information that's available into the basis of a well-reasoned, interesting, and scholarly piece of writing? Well, these are important questions. How do you work with the raw material to turn it into a great paper? We'll begin probing these important questions in the next program in the series. Thanks for watching, and see you when you return to the next program in Video-Aided Instructions series on writing a great research paper.
Do you want to earn better grades in school or boost your scores on standardized tests? Do you want to increase your fluency in English or improve your communication skills at work? Or do you simply want to relearn those forgotten grammar rules? Well, look no further. Video-Aided Instructions English Grammar Series is a great resource for everyone, whether you're new to English or you've been speaking it for years. Our one-of-a-kind series can help you master even the most complicated grammar topics. Be sure to view the entire series: English grammar sentence structure, parts of speech, sentence complements, verbs, pronouns, agreement, modifiers, parallel structure, punctuation, and spelling and capitalization. So don't let mistakes in English grammar embarrass you or hold you back. Let video-aided instruction help you eliminate them from your speaking and writing forever.